Hello everyone, it's Dr. A. I'm here today to give the lecture on late medieval and early Renaissance Northern Europe for my art history class. It's Renaissance to Contemporary. Today we're going to focus on how the Renaissance moved into Northern Europe and the consequences of the importation of that style for people and how it was done. And also the expression that we find in the north. It's different, doesn't look like Italy. But let's talk about what was happening in that period. In the 1400s, the period is framed, especially in the early part of the 1400s, is framed by the Great Schism. We talked about that in the last lecture, lesson 1. Where we have 2 popes, and we also have the 100 Years' War going on. The Renaissance and the dating of the Renaissance is always problematic, and I mean, you can say early 1400s, I've heard 1450, I've heard later dates, but it's a complex kind of argument among scholars. For our purposes, we're going to say early 1400s, right about what they call the Quattrocento, and then we're going to say that the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical antiquity. That too has been argued. There's always somebody who wants to show something different. But we do have a narrative that we can follow. We do know that the style itself is seen as being really essentially a product of Florence, and it moves out of Florence and moves north due to the travels of artists who go to Italy and are impressed, and they bring those ideas out and they disseminate them in the north. Especially we always talk about the great German artist Albrecht Dürer, who had a big influence on the adaptation of this style. The adapting of this style. There you go. Sorry. Anyway, we're going to talk about the Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance is framed in a couple of different ways. We're going to talk about the invention of the printing press. That's one of the things that the North had. We're also going to see it as mechanically reproducible images such as woodcuts and engravings have an important effect. We're also going to see the formation of a merchant class of art patrons. And also, this is framed within the context of the Protestant Reformation. In the Protestant Reformation, let me just briefly say, we see the translation of the Bible from original languages into the vernacular, especially first German and then French. We'll also have international trade centers develop, and a type of almost proto-capitalism is really born in this period. We have to start, though, this discussion with talking about Flanders, and it's always kind of a difficult discussion, if you will, because Flanders, the country itself, doesn't exist anymore. It disappears after the 2 World War I's and 1 and 2, and it's really consumed, if you will, for lack of a better word, by Belgium, modern Belgium. And so it's folded into it. I think that's a better way to think of it. And you can see here approximately where this area was. It's in here. And these are still the places that you find people who still speak Flemish. So it's not a totally dead language, but it is one that is disappearing. It is understandable for people to ask questions like, why Flanders? Well, Flanders was the most urbanized region of Northern Europe, and it had a large number of ports. And if you can see Bruges, that's right up here, right on the coast, it's pretty important. And there's a major center for trade in Northern Europe here. So they have money. And so between 1000 and 1300, it grew in size and it became the major center like I said, for trade in the north. Craftsmen of all types, painters, tapestry manufacturers, manuscript illuminators, goldsmith, and sculptors all rely on these trade networks. They need raw materials. And the towns themselves often acted as patrons, especially for things like commissioning sculpture for municipal buildings. Wealthy citizens in these towns also really helped spur the desire for art. And we have a part of this coming out of this period, growth in the Burgundian court and its influence. Burgundy is here, and it's kind of a convoluted story, if you will, but we have the Count of Flanders died, and he was succeeded by his son-in-law Philip the Bold, who was the Duke of Burgundy. And thus Burgundy really controls the area. Burgundian court and its influence are far-reaching in this period. We're going to see that the patronage of the Burgundian Count, the Duke of Burgundy, is going to be a couple of them, are going to have the the inevitable, if you will. Sorry, I'm trying to give you some more of the verbiage here. Building of churches, building of chapels, all of these things that are influential to and part of that position, but also helps artists. This particular place here, you see, is a Carthusian monastery and Chartreuse de Champmont. There's the architect, but we're not so much concerned with the architect here, that's what it looked like, as the fact that they wanted to make this a rival to Saint Denis in France. That's where the kings of France were buried. And so we have this desire by the Burgundian dukes to make this their kind of, if you will, Saint Denis. We're going to go over Saint Denis, so don't worry if you don't have any idea of what that is. And one of the first people to really emerge out of this period was the Flemish sculptor Klaus Sluiter. He will work on the church portal, and in that portal is, by the way, anything that has to do with the door. Okay, we'll see. He depicts the Philip the Bold and his wife Marguerite of Flanders. He'll also do in front of the Well of Moses. This is a striking departure from many of the things that had come in the medieval world, as we get this realistic masterpiece by Sluiter. And he is kind of an enigma in history. We don't really know exactly where he came from, but we do think he's a very early Netherlandish sculptor. He combines realism and spirituality. And this is really, really influential. His influence is great among painters as well as sculptors. So let's look at the portal here. And you can see that's let me get something to point with. Well, I'll just use the pointer. That's the Duke, and that's his wife. And they're both kneeling to Mary. Here she is, the Virgin with the Christ child. In this, the sculptor really makes a dynamic composition. We don't have much to compare this to from this period, especially in this area. But Sluiter's work is difficult to understand because the two tombs that were essentially his kind of piece de resistance were disassembled in the French Revolution. But he is an innovator in art, and he shows how he can bring volume to these pieces. It becomes a background, if you will, for what was happening in that period. It is definitely much more dynamic than anything we see from the medieval world. These kind of innovators in art will really make this period and this place become a fountainhead for the expression of the Northern Renaissance and the aesthetic that they bring with them. Manuscript painting is also something else that develops in the Flemish world. Now, we've not talked, well, we did in the first class. So if you didn't take the first class yet, just know manuscript painting is a big deal during the Middle Ages. And so we'll have that carry over, but it will see a great change, especially when we start to look at work like that being done by the Limburg brothers. This is called a Book of Hours, and a Book of Hours is like a calendar. Here's January, and the brothers themselves were skilled miniature painters, and we know something about them, but we do know there were 3 of them, and they weren't discovered as being important, let me move here, in the scope of work from this period until 1856, when this bibliophile lover of books discovered this. Though the exact birth and year of the brothers is not known, but it is believed that they all 3 died in a wave of plague in 1416. All were likely under 30. Pretty standard life expectancy in this period. They are really young, and probably we think they were apprenticed to a Parisian goldsmith. And this work here that you see from their Book of Hours depicting October is typical of these kind of commissions we see, you know, these Duke of Hours. The Duke of Berry is their great patron, and so this book is called The Beautiful Hours of the Duke of Berry. In October, we're going to see, and we'll, look at this. We see the warmer parts of Europe is the wine region, and that's what we see growing here. And it marks the month for grape harvest, and so that's what's being shown. October's labor is sowing the winter grain, and in the background is the 15th century Louvre. These can be really interesting as far as they're showing architectural stuff, and so we see that here. When we move on, so now let's get a better map of Flanders. So I did find one because I remember I put one in here. I just can't remember where. You can see how the country was centered. So there's Bruges, Antwerp, Ghent, Brussels, today modern Brussels. And we're going to move and talk about Robert Campin, also called the Master of Flamel, and his most famous work, the Maraude Dip. It was a triptych. Yeah, triptychs are 3 pieces. That's why TRY, trip, top for 3. And these were personal devotional pieces to be used in private space for them, the people who owned it, to pray in private, and it would have been set up in their house. And we know that it is one of the most, what would you call it's like a seminal piece. It really changes how Gothic art styles are moved away from it. They're no longer seen as being the center for this new time. But we have here in this 3-piece panel, the central panel is depicting the Annunciation. And then we think on the left is the owners of the piece. On the right is Joseph. And this private prayer piece, we're really not sure who the people are. Scholars are really unclear. They think it might have been businessmen, either Jan Engelbrecht or Peter Engelbrecht, a cloth merchant. But we're not sure what it is. It is a really celebrated early piece of Netherlandish painting. The 3 people here, like I said, to the left, the owners, and the right, the middle of the Annunciation. What I really love about this piece, though, is the fact that, let me see if I have a close-up. I thought I put one in here. Yeah, right here is the angel bringing the kind of message, if you will. And you can see it's very tiny. Again, I don't know. Yeah, I did get a close-up. I thought I had put one in there. And you can see here that light comes in with the angel and the beautiful treatment of the paint. I mean, it's just stunning. And you can see why this really lays the foundation for the modern development in painting that will happen next. Look at that. And their humility, and you can see the street, so it places us in the context. This is one of those documentary evidence pieces, you know kind of where you are because what you see outside there. And Joseph working humbly here as his wife receives that information that she will be giving birth to the Christ child. And that's about how big it is. So these aren't huge. Remember, they have to be in your house. We're going to end part 1 of this lecture here, and we'll pick up part 2 here.